I thought working the night shift at the regional distribution warehouse would be easy money. No customers, no daylight, just silence, steel, and the rhythmic sound of machines doing what they do best. It was meant to be temporary, a gig to cover rent while I figured things out. My role was simple: scan, lift, stock, repeat. But from the beginning, something about the place felt disjointed. The orientation video, for one, never changed. It played on loop in the break room every night, like clockwork, even after weeks of employment. Same corporate jingle, same over-enthusiastic narrator, same hypnotic line repeated at the end as if it were gospel. Stock what arrives. Store what stays. Secure what grows. I laughed at it the first few times, another cultish mantra from a megacorp. But the joke wore thin when I realized nobody else reacted. The other workers, mostly long-timers with pale skin and eyes that looked vacuumed of sleep, would just sit and watch, motionless, blank. One man, whose name tag only had a single letter, G, finally spoke to me after I brought it up. His voice was slow, deliberate, like it hadn't been used in a while, and he said, "Orientation never ends, not until you're shelved." He looked back at the screen like he hadn't spoken at all. As the nights wore on, I started noticing changes. Small things, easy to chalk up to fatigue at first. A forklift passing by without a driver. A scanner beeping even though no one was holding it. The clocks in the back office that all told slightly different times, always drifting further out of sync. The deeper I was assigned into the warehouse, especially in zones D through F, the stranger things became. A cold, artificial stillness filled the air past a certain aisle, like the air didn't want to be breathed. Pallets were stacked taller than regulations allowed, teetering with shrink-wrapped goods that no one ever seemed to touch. Some aisles led to rows of shelves that weren't on the map, their numbering inconsistent, like they'd been rearranged by something without understanding how humans navigated space. I once spotted a tall figure in the distance, moving too quickly through the racks, wearing the same uniform I had, but with a face I couldn't quite focus on, as if my brain refused to register it. What truly broke my sense of normalcy was a bin at the far end of Zone F, tucked behind a half-locked loading gate. It was marked unsortable in what looked like scratched metal rather than a printed label, as if someone had etched it in out of desperation. The object inside was wrapped in thick layers of black plastic and industrial tape, overwrapped, suffocated, like someone was trying to mummify the contents in forgetfulness. Out of curiosity or boredom, I peeled back a corner one night. I expected to find damaged merchandise or expired goods, maybe a crate of busted coffee makers. What I found instead was the edge of a human hand, discolored, stiff, with curled fingers as though it had been mid-motion when it froze forever. It didn't look fake. It looked like something that had once reached for help. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and turned to call for Roderick, the shift supervisor, a man with a clipboard always in hand and eyes that never blinked. But as soon as I moved, the overhead lights flickered violently and went out, plunging everything into complete darkness. There was no backup generator hum, no emergency lights, just a thick, suffocating blackness and the faint sound of something mechanical echoing in the distance. A scanner, maybe, beeping again and again, each tone bouncing through the void as if searching for something. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, until the lights snapped back on without warning. But when they did, the bin was gone. No wrapper, no hand, no evidence that it had ever been there. I expected someone to say something, maybe a prank, maybe a mistake. But Roderick only looked at me, handed me a new scanner without a word, and motioned me back toward my section with that same expressionless smile he always wore. I asked about the loading gate and the bin. He didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken. That night, it occurred to me that maybe we weren't tracking inventory at all. Maybe we were the inventory, that every scan, every barcode, every entry wasn't about products, but people, logged, categorized, processed. And that maybe the reason no one ever seemed to leave this place had nothing to do with job loyalty. After that night, I tried convincing myself it had all been a hallucination, a trick of overwork, poor sleep, and the warehouse's unnatural quiet. But the thought gnawed at me, that hand, frozen mid-reach, wrapped in black like a secret no one wanted uncovered. I stopped bringing it up. I stopped asking questions, but I couldn't stop noticing things. For instance, there were aisles, actual numbered aisles, that didn't appear on the floor plan they gave me on my first day. Aisles labeled 101 through 110, tucked far beyond Zone F, in an area that didn't seem to end. One night, I decided to follow one of the forklifts that moved without a driver. I stayed just out of view, trailing it past the final mapped zone. The further it went, the more the warehouse transformed. Light fixtures hung too low, casting stretched shadows that never quite aligned with the objects. The walls lost their sterile grey colour and turned a sickly, peeling yellow. My scanner, which usually beeped every few seconds for no reason, fell completely silent. Not even static, like it knew this wasn't a place for documentation. The forklift stopped at an open corridor that sloped downward, unnaturally steep for a warehouse. Gravity pulled at me. I hesitated, but something about the slope was magnetic, as if the air itself wanted me to descend. The corridor curved slightly, and with each step I took, the sound of machinery faded, replaced by something more organic, wet thumps, dragging noises, the occasional faint groan that I desperately hoped was just pipes. The temperature dropped. My breath misted in front of me. Then the walls changed. They weren't concrete anymore. They were something else. Smooth but damp. Organic yet polished, like polished bone or frozen meat. My boots echoed differently here. Not a sharp clack, but a soft squelch, as if the floor was absorbing my weight. At the bottom of the slope was a wide chamber, lined with racks unlike any I'd seen before. These weren't for storing goods. They weren't metal shelves or plastic bins. They were long, vertical pods, stacked 10 high and 50 across, embedded directly into the walls like a honeycomb. Each pod had a small window, and behind each window was a person, or what used to be one. Some were moving slightly. Some looked directly at me. All of them wore the same uniform I did: blue shirt, black pants, white name badge. Many of the name tags were smeared, but some were still legible. G. S. Palmer, Roderick? My supervisor. I stared at his pod for what felt like hours. He didn't blink. His eyes were open and dry, but his chest moved subtly, like a body kept alive just enough to not be called dead. I heard movement behind me and turned, expecting maybe a co-worker or even a manager. What I saw was a tall figure, almost my height, but thinner, almost impossibly so, as if it had been flattened. Its face was a blur, constantly shifting like static on a television. It wore the same uniform as me, but where my shirt had sweat stains and lint, its was pristine. It didn't walk, it glided, feet never quite touching the floor, yet making that same wet, squelching sound. It raised a finger and pointed to a nearby pod. My name was on the tag. I ran. I don't remember the sprint back up the corridor, only that it felt like it took longer to escape than it did to descend. My scanner started beeping again the moment I returned to the normal warehouse zones, as if rebooting from a deep coma. I ran straight to the locker room, threw up in the sink, and stared at myself in the mirror for 20 minutes, trying to believe I still had a reflection. I was ready to walk out. I didn't care about the paycheck anymore. But when I reached the exit, The badge scanner didn't recognize my card. The guard at the front desk, one I hadn't seen before, simply looked at me and said, "Your shift isn't over, you haven't been shelved." I returned the next night. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't not return. My key card started working again without explanation. My bank account showed a generous deposit labeled bonus adjustment, even though I'd logged out early. My phone, usually riddled with notifications and missed calls, was empty. It was as if the outside world had quietly stepped aside to let the warehouse consume me uninterrupted. Inside, the warehouse had changed. Aisles had been rearranged. Pallets that were once full were empty, yet still marked as stocked in the scanner system. The voice from the orientation video now occasionally whispered through the warehouse PA, distorted and slowed down, as if played on degrading tape. Stock what arrives. Store what stays. Secure what grows. The last phrase always echoed longer, as if something behind the speakers wanted me to listen closer. I was assigned a new section that night, Zone G. On paper, it didn't exist. I checked every document I had, even accessed the employee portal from the backroom terminal. There was no Zone G. And yet it had a sign, flickering under industrial light, nailed into concrete like it had always been there. Inside Zone G, the shelves were different. Thicker, older. They were covered in what looked like soot, or perhaps a black mold that no cleaning crew had ever tried to scrub. Every time I scanned a product, the screen displayed a human name, not an item. Ellen M., aged 34, status in transit. Gerald V., aged 19, status sedated. The scanner beeped happily as if this were completely normal. I nearly dropped the device when my name flashed across the screen after a misscan. Your name. Status, misplaced. Reassigning shelf location. The lights in Zone G dimmed suddenly, and behind me, one of the shelving units groaned and shifted. Not from an earthquake, it moved with intent. Slowly at first, like a tower waking from slumber. I backed away, heart pounding, and then it twisted slightly, an entire rack pivoting on its base to face me like a sentinel. Each pod inside it lit up for a second, revealing blurred human silhouettes inside, suspended in some kind of viscous fluid. They were all breathing, barely. Their eyes twitched under closed lids, their hands flexed as if trying to push out. I don't know what came over me, some mix of terror and defiance, but I screamed, loud. It echoed back far longer than it should have, and in the echo, I heard multiple voices return my scream, my voice repeated back to me. Dozens of versions, younger, older, tired, angry, all of them mine, all of them shelved. I tried to run. The scanner pulsed red and began emitting a low hum. Every exit I reached was gone, swallowed by racks that hadn't been there seconds before. My path was being rewritten in real time, like the warehouse itself had grown aware of my disobedience. I found a narrow stairwell labeled S-Access, authorized only. The door wasn't locked. I yanked it open and plunged into darkness. The stairs descended in tight spirals, metal steps creaking underfoot, the walls slick with condensation. Every 10 feet or so I passed signage that made no sense. Sectioned employees, batch 2714. Memory erasure pending. Shelf stability, 87%. My hands trembled as I ran them along the railing. It wasn't metal. It felt like bone. Smooth, polished vertebrae that clicked quietly under my touch. At the bottom of the stairwell was a room with no lights. Only a humming glow from hundreds of scanners lining the walls, all turned inward toward a single object. A broken pallet jack surrounded by mold, crushed plastic bins, and what looked like clothing. Employee uniforms, all blue, all the same size. I stepped closer and saw a mirror mounted on the far wall, pristine despite the decay. I looked into it and saw myself. But I didn't blink. My reflection stared back, unbroken, like a paused video. When I stepped away, it stayed still for a moment longer before mimicking my exit with a slight delay. My reflection didn't follow me. It watched me leave. I found my way back to the main warehouse floor around 3 a.m. Roderick was waiting near the break room, clipboard in hand, smile in place, as if nothing had happened. "Your new zone assignment's ready," he said flatly. "Looks like you've been moved to long-term storage." I tried to respond, to protest, but my throat felt dry, unused. I hadn't spoken since the scream. I couldn't remember how. That night, I dreamed of racks that whispered, and they whispered my name. The following days passed in fragments, like my memory was being skimmed off the top layer by something just out of reach. I would clock in, and the next thing I knew, I'd be standing in front of a new zone, a different scanner in my hand, with my shift nearly over and a vague nausea lingering in my stomach like an aftershock. I stopped questioning it. Part of me didn't want to know, but the warehouse didn't care about my denial. It kept inviting me deeper, offering little anomalies like breadcrumbs, labels that peeled themselves off, pallets with blinking lights, radios playing lullabies in reverse. One morning, while checking my schedule on the employee portal, I noticed a new tab next to my name. Classification level, C variant. There was no explanation, no way to edit it, just a grey icon pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. By that point, I'd stopped reporting strange events. HR no longer answered emails. My calls went directly to static. The only help available came in the form of training modules that auto-played while I was in the break room, modules I couldn't skip or mute. They weren't about safety or product handling anymore. They were instructional, procedural, guides on how to be still, how to slow your breathing to match shelf standards, how to harmonize with storage environments. One module ended with the phrase, "Compliance is compression, compression is peace." I vomited in the trash can and found no one around to notice, not even Roderick. Zone Z appeared one day like it had always existed. It was clean, too clean. White tiles, white lights, walls that curved slightly, like I was inside something circular. There were no products here, only mirrors. Mirrors facing each other down a long corridor, creating the illusion of infinite versions of me staring back. Each one slightly off. One smiled when I didn't. One blinked slower. One mouthed words I hadn't spoken. I walked for what felt like hours, my footsteps muffled despite the hard floor. I eventually reached a door marked with my employee ID. The scanner by the door didn't require a badge. It scanned my face, then my eyes. Then it asked for a memory. A panel slid open, revealing a screen. Words appeared. "Upload memory to proceed." Below that, a date and time were listed. It was the day I first started working here. The screen pulsed. I don't know how, but I felt something pulling at me, like the screen was reaching in, not physically, but mentally, clawing through my thoughts. I felt pain behind my eyes, sharp and surgical. Then something inside me shifted, clicked, and the door opened. Inside was a narrow room with a single chair and a table. On the table was a folder labeled Reclassification, Active. The contents inside were pages of observations, notes about me, my walking pattern, my diet, my sleep, dreams I hadn't told anyone about. One sheet listed abnormal resistance level, elevated, shelf integration, delayed, recommend, phased conditioning. At the bottom of the final page was a sentence that froze my blood. Subject exhibits autonomous reflection behavior. Begin mirror reversal protocol. That night, I woke up in my own bed, but it wasn't mine. Everything looked identical, but subtly wrong. My lamp was on the wrong side. My toothbrush was wet, though I hadn't used it. My phone had only one contact. Roderick. When I looked in the mirror, I finally understood. The face staring back was mine, but not quite. The eyes were duller. The smile was pre-installed. It blinked a second before I did, and when I whispered, "Who are you?" the reflection mouthed back, "You've been stalked." I stopped going home after that night. Or rather, I stopped pretending that home was somewhere outside the warehouse. Every time I stepped beyond its walls, the world lost clarity. Faces blurred, voices warped, colors drained from reality like cheap dye in water. Even my own memories faded the moment I tried to grasp them, like dreams waking too fast. But inside the warehouse, inside its humming concrete belly, things had meaning. Time passed differently here, but at least it passed. The shelves welcomed me, the scanners responded to me like I was a vital part of them now, no longer an employee, but a component. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought resignation. They gave me a new uniform. It arrived in my locker folded perfectly, though I hadn't opened it in days. The fabric was softer, tighter, something between synthetic and skin. I put it on because I no longer questioned these things. As I pulled it over my arms, I noticed the barcode stitched into the sleeve. Not printed, stitched like veins. My scanner beeped when I passed the break room, reading me automatically. A voice from the PA whispered softly, almost kindly, "Unit recognized, integration phase beginning." That night, I was reassigned to the lower levels, no name for the floor. Just a downward-pointing arrow and a new access badge that wasn't made of plastic, but something warmer. Organic. The elevator ride down was longer than any I'd taken. The hum of the motor became rhythmic, like a heartbeat syncing with mine. I tried not to breathe. The air smelled like solder and wet soil. The doors opened to darkness pierced by red running lights. The shelves here were different, rounded more like hives than storage units. And instead of boxes or crates, they housed people. Standing upright, eyes closed, skin pale and luminescent. Each one had a slot in their chest where a scanner rested, pulsing like a firefly. Their mouths moved slightly, whispering inaudible phrases synchronized like sleep talkers in prayer. A monitor nearby displayed footage of me, except I wasn't in the warehouse. I was at a register, smiling, serving a customer, laughing. My hands moved perfectly, but I wasn't there. That version of me blinked too slowly, didn't respond to background noise, didn't flinch when a child screamed nearby. A placeholder, a stocked replica. Then came the voice, Roderick's, but deeper, slower, like a recording being played at half speed. Now that your copy is fully integrated into surface operations, your original self can begin final formatting. You have been preserved, with purpose. I turned to run, but the aisles had shifted again. They always did. Behind me, the wall opened like a breathing lung and arms extended from it. Not mechanical, not flesh, something in between. They didn't grab me, they simply hovered, waiting, inviting. I collapsed from exhaustion or surrender. I'm not sure which. When I woke up, I was standing upright inside one of the pods, the scanner slot embedded in my chest, warm against my heart. I wasn't restrained. I didn't need to be. The system had won. My thoughts were no longer mine. They were tasks, my memories, inventory logs. I wasn't scared anymore. That emotion had been removed, cleared to make room for operational clarity. I saw others now, other workers I'd known, Maria from shipping, Derek from cleaning. They were here too, perfectly still in their pods, expressionless and pristine. Each one stored, categorized, updated. And then I saw one pod, empty, flickering red. My name was etched above it. The system spoke once more. Your shelf is ready." And I walked in. The call center at night was nothing like the bustling hive of daytime chaos. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, their harsh buzz slicing through the heavy silence that settled like a second skin over the room. Rows upon rows of empty desks stretched out before me, each with its own lonely glow from a sleeping computer, like tombstones in a graveyard of productivity. The air was stale, recycled 1,000 times over, but tonight it felt different, darker, heavier, as if some invisible presence had made itself comfortable within these walls. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the cold linoleum as I walked to my station, my breath forming small, fleeting clouds in the sudden chill. Around me, the usual nighttime hum of soft chatter and clacking keyboards was absent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed eager to swallow sound itself. The headset felt foreign and heavy on my head as I slid it on, the plastic strap digging into my scalp like a shackle. From the moment the first call came through, everything began to unravel. The voices on the other end weren't the usual disgruntled customers or confused clients. No, these were whispers, fractured, unintelligible murmurs that slithered through the line like cold fingers brushing against my eardrums. I leaned closer to the microphone, trying to catch what was being said, but the words dissolved into static, slipping just beyond comprehension. And then, faint but unmistakable, a voice emerged, a low, guttural hiss repeating a single, chilling phrase. "Don't let it in." The hairs on my arms stood on end as a sudden shiver coursed down my spine. I glanced around, but the office was empty, the cubicles vacant and dark except for the pale glow of my screen. No one else seemed to notice, heads bowed and faces illuminated by monitors, oblivious or unwilling to see what I was feeling. The calls kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Some were brief, barely more than gasps and cries that cut off mid-sentence, while others carried strange sounds, breathing heavy and ragged, distant sobbing, the metallic scrape of something dragging across the floor. Occasionally, a static burst would erupt, drowning out all other noise, only to give way to silence so thick it pressed against my ears, making it hard to breathe. Time slipped away in distorted waves. Clocks on the walls seemed to slow, their hands twitching erratically, as if struggling against an unseen force. Shadows pooled beneath desks and stretched long and twisted along the walls, moving as if alive, teasing the edges of my vision. I could feel eyes, dozens of them, watching from the darkness, unblinking and patient. My rational mind screamed to disconnect, to leave, but some cruel tether kept me anchored, compelled to listen, to answer. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as the office lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a breathless moment before sputtering back to life. In that heartbeat of blackness I heard it, a slow, dragging footstep approaching from the maze of cubicles, deliberate and heavy, but when I turned, nothing was there. Only silence, thick and suffocating, wrapping tighter around me with every breath. The voice came again, clearer this time, whispering from everywhere and nowhere. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped, my throat clenched shut, my body frozen in place. The headset crackled violently, then went dead, leaving me alone with the echo of those words in my mind. I realized then that this night wasn't just a shift to endure, it was a trial I was losing. The walls weren't just walls, the darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was alive, patient, hungry, and somehow I had stepped into its grasp, becoming another voice trapped on the line, waiting for the next call. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes with a cruel mockery, each second dragging like a lead weight through the thickened air. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as I waited for the next call to pierce the silence that now felt like a living entity pressing down on my chest. The monitors glowed faintly in the gloom, casting eerie reflections that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of sight. Every so often, a cold draft would snake through the cubicles, carrying with it the faintest scent, something metallic, sharp, and unmistakably wrong. It clung to the back of my throat, an invisible poison seeping into my mind. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus, but the darkness around me was patient, spreading like ink, curling its tendrils through the empty spaces, whispering promises I dared not understand. When the phone finally rang again, it shattered the silence like a scream in an empty theater. I picked up with a shaky breath, bracing for the familiar sound of anger or confusion. But what came through was something else entirely. A voice, fragmented and cracked, like it had traveled through endless tunnels and broken wires before reaching me. It spoke in half words, begging, pleading, warning me of things beyond comprehension. "You don't belong here," it hissed. "They're coming." The line crackled, a static roar, drowning out the words, then silence. I sat frozen, heart pounding in my ears, fingers gripping the edge of my desk as if it were a lifeline. The office around me seemed to pulse with unseen life, shadows deepening, stretching, closing in like a predator circling its prey. The minutes blurred into one another as the calls grew stranger, more desperate. Sometimes the voice on the line was gone entirely, replaced by a hollow silence that pressed unbearably against my eardrums. Other times it was laughter, low, guttural, dripping with malice, echoing through the receiver and settling into my bones. The steady glow of the exit signs flickered, threatening to plunge the room into darkness. I wanted to stand, to run, to tear off the headset and flee the building, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place by a terror I couldn't name. I could feel it moving in the shadows now, closer than before, a presence so cold it seemed to suck the warmth from the very air. The glow from my screen dimmed, flickered, then went black, plunging me into a darkness so complete it was like drowning in ink. And then through the void, a whisper. "You can't hang up now." The longer I stayed in that dim-lit chamber of whispers and shadows, the more the call center began to twist and warp into something unrecognizable. The familiar rows of cubicles stretched into endless corridors, their outlines blurred like watercolors bleeding in the dark. The faint hum of the computers became a low chant, rhythmic and hypnotic, pulling at the edges of my sanity. Each time I glanced at the clock, its hands spun wildly backward, mocking the very passage of time. The office was no longer a place of work. It was a labyrinth designed to trap me, to bleed away my will piece by piece. Calls came in waves now, but they weren't calls at all. They were cries, screams, and fragmented memories transmitted through static-laden lines. One voice begged for release, whispering names I didn't recognize but felt burned into my soul. Another spoke in an ancient tongue, the syllables curling like smoke around my mind, invoking something dark and ancient. My headset felt heavier with each passing moment, as if the voices themselves were tethering me to the other side. I tried to pull it off to silence the cacophony, but my fingers wouldn't obey. They trembled, locked in place by fear and something far worse, desperation. The shadows under my desk thickened, forming shapes that writhed and reached like grasping hands, desperate to drag me into the abyss. I saw movement in the corner of my eye, figures standing just beyond the glow of my monitor, faces obscured, bodies twisted in unnatural angles. When I turned, they vanished, leaving only the stale scent of decay behind. The lights flickered violently and a chill swept through the room, chilling me to the bone. I felt a presence, cold, watchful, patient, circling me like a predator savoring the hunt. The whispering voices crescendoed into a single phrase repeated over and over. "Stay. Forever." Panic clawed its way up my throat, choking me, but escape was impossible. The doors at the far end of the room, which should have been my salvation, shimmered and dissolved into darkness. There was no exit here, no end. Just me, the voices, and the creeping terror that seeped into every corner of the night. I realized then with a sinking dread that I wasn't just trapped in this place, I was becoming part of it. A ghost in the machine, a whisper in the static, forever bound to the endless night shift where the call center's real customers were the lost, the damned, and the forgotten. The oppressive atmosphere of the call center thickened like a shroud as the night deepened, the line between reality and nightmare blurring with every heartbeat. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls, as if the very fabric of the room was alive and breathing. My fingers hovered uselessly over the keyboard, the headset a heavy weight tethering me to a world slipping beyond comprehension. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the horrors unfolding within this sterile cage of cubicles and cold screens. Voices poured through the receiver in a relentless torrent, some pleading, some screaming, others silent, but brimming with an unbearable presence that pressed against my eardrums like an unseen hand. I could hear them, the lost souls trapped in the void between calls, reaching out with desperation, their words laced with warnings and curses. "Don't answer," one hissed. "It's watching," whispered another. I tried to resist, to hang up, but the headset was no longer mine to control. It felt fused to my skin, pulling me deeper into its web. A whisper slithered through the speaker, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. Then it grew louder, a chorus of voices rising in a haunting symphony of despair and anger. They called my name over and over, a mantra woven from pain and rage. My skin crawled, goosebumps rising in cold waves as the shadows gathered closer, pressing in from all sides. I tried to pull the headset away, but my hands were no longer mine. They moved with a mind of their own, gripping the device tighter, binding me to the torment that seeped from the speaker like poison. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with a rhythm that matched the erratic beating of my heart. Shadows curled at the edges of my vision, flickering and retreating just when I dared to look. A sudden coldness settled over me, colder than the night air, sharper than any winter chill. The faint scent of something burning, flesh maybe, wafted faintly through the stagnant air. My breath caught as the phone rang again, each shrill tone slicing through the silence like a blade. I answered, and the voice on the other end was no longer human. It was something older, something hungry, breath ragged, words broken but filled with malice. "You belong to us now," it said. "There is no escape." The line went dead, plunging me into an echoing silence that screamed louder than any noise. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear off the headset and break free, but I was frozen, caught in the grip of a terror that seeped into my bones. Hours slipped away, or maybe minutes. I could no longer tell. Time had become a twisted loop, the same calls cycling endlessly, the same voices circling like vultures. The call center was no longer a workplace. It was a purgatory, a place where lost souls were trapped in an eternal night shift, their torment broadcast through crackling lines and flickering screens. And I was the newest prisoner, a ghost in the machine, forever answering the calls of the damned. The room grew colder still, the air thick with a suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums like a vice. My eyes darted nervously around the cubicle, catching fleeting shadows that slipped just beyond the reach of the weak, fluorescent lights. Each breath came out in shaky bursts, fogging the cool glass of my monitor as if the chill inside was seeping into my very lungs. The headset hummed softly, almost alive, whispering secrets I couldn't quite catch. The line was dead until suddenly it wasn't. A whisper slithered through the speaker, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. Then it grew louder, a chorus of voices rising in a haunting symphony of despair and anger. They called my name over and over, a mantra woven from pain and rage. My skin crawled, goosebumps rising in cold waves as the shadows gathered closer, pressing in from all sides. I tried to pull the headset away, but my hands were no longer mine. They moved with a mind of their own, gripping the device tighter, binding me to the torment that seeped from the speaker like poison. The room warped around me. Walls bled shadows, cubicles stretched into endless corridors lined with faces twisted in silent screams. The phone rang again, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the fragile veil of reality. I answered, voice trembling, only to hear breathing, slow, deliberate, and inhuman. A presence moved just behind me, colder than the void, heavier than fear. I dared not turn, knowing whatever lurked there was the source of the darkness that had claimed this place. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as the voices rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of souls lost to this endless night shift. The call center was no longer a place of work. It was a tomb, a nexus where the living were dragged into a nightmare beyond death. And I was trapped at its center, a beacon calling out to the darkness, forever answering the calls of the forsaken. The hospital at night isn't the place you think it is. It's not quiet, not safe. It's a breathing, watching thing, a cage of cold steel and flickering lights where the dead don't stay dead. When I started my shift in Ward C, the shadows weren't just absence of light. They were alive, curling around corners like fingers reaching for something lost. The smell was wrong, antiseptic mixed with decay, a metallic tang that coated my throat and made each breath a razor. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed low like distant thunder trapped inside glass tubes, and the silence between their flickers was so thick it swallowed my footsteps whole. I told myself it was just exhaustion, nerves, the stress of working nights in a place where hope goes to die. But deep down, I knew better. Because from the moment I walked through those swinging doors, something was waiting, watching, hungry. The first few hours blurred into a strange rhythm, checking vitals, noting charts, the mechanical beep of monitors providing a heartbeat for a ward that felt anything but alive. The patients here were shadows of themselves, some barely clinging to consciousness, others staring too long with eyes that held unspoken stories. Their skin was too pale, too smooth, almost like porcelain dolls that had cracked just enough to leak something dark beneath. Every glance from them felt like a silent plea or a warning. There was a story about this ward, whispered quietly among the night nurses. The midnight visitor. No one really believed it, but they all felt its presence. A figure in torn scrubs, face obscured in shadow, walking the halls just after midnight. They said monitors would spike without cause, machines would fail, and sometimes stable patients flatlined with no explanation. The staff called it a curse or a ghost, depending on who you asked. I laughed it off until the night I saw the flicker of movement just beyond the end of the hallway, where the emergency exit sign blinked like a faltering heartbeat. A silhouette, gone the moment I blinked. Then the whispers started. Soft voices, barely audible but insistent, seeming to come from the very walls that had witnessed countless deaths, too many secrets buried in their cracked paint and peeling tiles. As I moved from room to room, doors slightly ajar revealed beds that sometimes appeared empty, sometimes held figures who moved too slowly, their breathing shallow and rhythmic, like puppets on strings no one could see. One door creaked open as I approached. Inside was an empty bed, monitors beeping steadily as if someone lay there. but the patient chart on the door carried a name I'd never seen, names that belonged to people long dead, decades ago. Past midnight, the ward seemed to warp. Hallways stretched and bent, folding back on themselves in impossible ways. The flickering lights cast grotesque shadows that danced just out of sight. My radio crackled with static before voices filled the air, urgent and panicked, calling my name from rooms that didn't exist. I kept moving forward. There was no turning back. The hospital was alive, watching, waiting. And somewhere in the darkness, the midnight visitor was coming for his rounds. The deeper into the night I went, the heavier the air became, as if the ward itself was breathing, exhaling a cold dread that settled into my bones. The corridors grew narrower, or maybe it was just my mind bending the space. Walls seemed to lean in, their chipped paint peeling like dead skin, shadows pooling in corners where no light reached. I tried to focus on my rounds, on the beeping machines and ticking clocks, but the silence between those sounds was deafening. The steady rhythm of life and death felt more like a countdown, each tick a reminder that time here was both infinite and cruelly fleeting. Patients whispered in tongues I didn't understand, murmurs curling like smoke just out of clear hearing. Sometimes a hand would twitch under the thin hospital sheets, but when I looked closer, the flesh beneath looked too cold, too still, like a mask stretched over a hollow frame. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the end of the hall, where the emergency exit flickered like a dying flame. That spot held something watching, waiting. I began to hear footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, but whenever I turned, the corridor was empty except for my own trembling shadow. Then came the room that changed everything. It wasn't on any map, no chart referenced it, and the door bore no number. The sign above it was scratched away, but inside I found a small cot, a single light bulb swinging gently from the ceiling, casting fractured light across peeling wallpaper stained with age. The air was thick with the scent of rot and something metallic, like blood long dried. On the cot lay a figure curled tightly, eyes closed, but lips moving silently in some ancient prayer or curse. The skin was translucent, veins like dark rivers beneath the surface. As I stepped closer, the figure's eyes snapped open, revealing empty pits that swallowed the light. I ran blindly, the corridors twisting and turning like a nightmare maze. Doors slammed shut behind me, the temperature dropped until my breath became visible, white ghosts in the black. Somewhere far off, a machine beeped, slowly, rhythmically, like a heart refusing to stop. I knew I was being hunted, not by flesh and blood, but by something far older, far crueler. And as the midnight hour waned, I realized there was no escape. This hospital was not a place for the living anymore. It was a tomb, and I was its newest prisoner. I stumbled back, heart hammering, but the figure whispered my name soft and rasping, a voice from beneath the earth. The walls seemed to pulse with that voice, the very hospital itself groaning under the weight of its secrets. I fumbled for my radio, but it screamed with static, then fell silent. The lights flickered violently, and I was plunged into darkness so complete it pressed against my skin like cold water. In that moment, the whispers swelled into a chorus, voices of the forgotten, the lost, the dead, calling me to join their endless vigil. The hospital seemed to breathe around me, its stale air heavy with the scent of antiseptic, decay, and something far fouler, like the last breath of a forgotten soul. My feet moved mechanically, tracing the same endless corridors that warped and twisted beyond logic. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, quivering shadows that seemed to pulse with life, sometimes taking shape as hands clawing at the walls, sometimes as faces contorted in silent screams. I was caught in a nightmare where reality was unraveling, where every step felt both familiar and alien. The walls whispered, their voices curling around my thoughts like smoke, speaking in a language older than the hospital itself. I caught fragments, names, dates, promises broken long ago, and warnings meant for those who dared to listen. The weight of centuries of suffering pressed down on me, a suffocating presence that settled in my chest and clouded my mind. Somewhere deep inside, I knew I was no longer just a nurse on the night shift. I was a prisoner in a place that refused to let go, a ghost in the machinery of death. Returning to that unmarked room felt like returning to the heart of the abyss. The weak bulb overhead swung slowly, casting fractured light over the peeling wallpaper, stained with the ghosts of old blood. Figures emerged from the shadows, twisted, pale, their eyes hollow voids that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Their hands reached out in silent pleas, desperate to grasp something solid, to tether themselves to the world they had lost. One figure stepped closer, its mouth opening in a silent scream that echoed inside my skull, a soundless wail that tore at the edges of my sanity. I felt myself drawn to them, pulled by a force I could neither resist nor understand. The midnight visitor, I realized, was not just a phantom, but the embodiment of every sorrow, every lost hope, every act of cruelty this ward had witnessed. The patients, trapped between life and death, had become something else. Shadows fused with rage and despair, doomed to wander these halls forever. And I was being dragged into their endless vigil. Panic surged through me, but my body betrayed me. My voice caught in my throat as the walls closed in, twisting the corridors into impossible angles. Doors led nowhere, windows showed only darkness, and the hospital's heartbeat, the steady beep of a distant monitor, grew louder, pounding in my ears like a funeral drum. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into hours, hours folded into moments, and I was lost in a place where the boundary between the living and the dead blurred. I screamed, finally, but the sound was swallowed whole, leaving only silence. My shadow stretched across the floor, merging with the dark figures that surrounded me. The last thing I saw before the world faded was a pair of empty eyes, staring back with endless hunger. When the morning shift arrived, they found only the empty ward, the echoes of a nightmare etched into the peeling walls, and the faintest trace of a whispered warning. Stay forever. Dawn never truly arrived in Ward C. The outside world might have been waking, birds singing, sun rising, but inside those walls, time remained fractured, caught between moments, slipping through cracks like water. After what felt like an eternity trapped in that shifting maze, I finally found a flicker of something different, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was heavy, scarred with years of neglect, and it groaned loudly as I pushed it open. Beyond was a small storage room, cluttered with forgotten equipment, dusty charts, and a single chair facing a cracked mirror that seemed out of place in this sterile nightmare. I sat, exhausted and trembling, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered mind. The mirror didn't reflect my face. Instead, it showed a warped version of the ward behind me, twisted and dark, filled with figures crouched and watching. Their eyes burned like coals, burning away the edges of reality. When I looked away, the reflection lingered in my vision, a ghost haunting my sight. The room around me began to pulse, walls breathing in and out, until the chair beneath me felt like it was sinking, dragging me down into the floor. Suddenly a sharp, cold touch grazed my neck, like fingers made of ice, and I spun around, but no one was there. The air thickened with whispers, growing louder, forming words I could almost understand. Names were called out, patients who had died years before, nurses who had vanished without a trace. Their voices were urgent, pleading for release or revenge. I couldn't tell which. I realized then that I wasn't alone. Something else had come into this room with me, something ancient and hungry. I stumbled out, heart pounding, into the endless corridor. But the hospital had changed again. The clean tiles were cracked and stained with dark, sticky patches that seemed to writhe when I looked away. The flickering lights now cast not just shadows, but shapes, hunched figures lurking just beyond sight, whispering threats I couldn't escape. The monitors beeped irregularly, some flatlining without explanation, others screaming with alarms that made my ears bleed. My radio crackled for the first time in hours, a voice bleeding through the static, urgent, desperate. It was a call for help from a patient who didn't exist on any chart, trapped in a room that shouldn't be there. I followed the voice, heart pounding as I navigated the twisting halls that now felt like a tomb. Each step echoed with the sound of footsteps not my own, growing louder, closer, but when I turned, there was only emptiness. Reaching the door, I pushed it open to find a room bathed in unnatural darkness. In the center lay a figure, pale and still, but its chest rose and fell with slow, uneven breaths. As I approached, the figure's eyes snapped open, black voids that swallowed the light. The voice came again, this time from the figure itself. Whispering my name and promising salvation or damnation, I wasn't sure which. The hospital was no longer just a place of work. It was a predator, and I was its prey. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating like a dense fog made of despair. The figure on the bed didn't move, yet its presence pressed against my skin like a weight. I felt the cold seep into my bones, the unmistakable chill of something no living being should endure. Every instinct screamed to flee, but my legs were rooted to the floor, as if the hospital itself had claimed me. Then the black voids where its eyes should have been blinked, and a low, guttural sound slipped from its throat, a sound not quite human, but not entirely otherworldly either. It echoed in my mind, twisting my thoughts and unraveling my sense of reality. I staggered back, knocking over a rusted metal tray that clanged loudly against the floor, breaking the oppressive silence for a moment. The dark figure moved with unnatural speed, gliding off the bed and reaching toward me with fingers that stretched impossibly long. Panic flared, a hot, burning fire that lit a path through the paralyzing cold. I turned and bolted, the echo of those crawling fingers scraping the floor behind me like nails on a chalkboard, a terrible, relentless pursuit. The corridors morphed again, walls bleeding shadows that writhed and whispered secrets meant to trap me forever. I passed empty rooms filled with shattered equipment and half-finished charts, relics of lives and deaths that didn't belong to the present. Somewhere, a machine began a slow, rhythmic beeping, like a heartbeat trying desperately to survive. I clung to that sound, a fragile lifeline in a world unraveling. Then I heard it, a faint voice, barely audible, calling my name from the depths of the hospital. It was soft, coaxing, almost familiar. Desperation warring with fear, I followed the sound, hoping for rescue, but the voice led me only deeper into the labyrinth of lost souls and broken memories. Each step felt heavier, as if invisible hands were dragging me down, anchoring me to the nightmare. Suddenly I was back in that unmarked room, alone except for the dark figure watching silently from the corner. Its eyes glowed faintly now, like dying embers, filled with a sorrow that cut deeper than fear. For a moment I understood. It wasn't just a predator, but a prisoner too, bound by the same curse that held this place in its suffocating grip. But understanding brought no relief. The hospital's hunger was endless, and now I was part of its eternal round. If this tale sent a chill down your spine or made you glance twice into the dark, then you're already one of us. Subscribe to The Fear Right, where the stories never truly end, and neither does the fear, and leave a comment below with the nightmares you want told next. Something always listens from the other side, and your voice might be the one that wakes it.